go ahead and kick this off. We might get some stragglers popping on here, but I want to make sure we have time for everything today because I am super excited about this. So rather than like everybody doing introductions on video, if you guys could just chime in on the chat and kind of let us know who you are, where you work, where you're working from, anything that might be interesting, that would be great. If you hover over the Zoom window, you should get a little toolbar that pops up at the bottom or the top, and chat will be an option there where you can open up the chat window. So let us know who you are. And then I am thrilled that we have a special guest joining our video call today. So Amanda Jarman is the president of Fundraising Nerd, which is consulting and training around donor data. And before this, she was in advancement services and prospect research at Lewis and Clark and at Portland State. Is that right?
Awesome. You got it. Yep.
So coming to us live and virtually from Central America today. But she is going to be giving us kind of a brief presentation so we can all get some background knowledge about how gender inclusivity in donor data works. And then we'll open up most of the time today for questions and conversations about what you guys are doing in your own shops. We are recording this and I will send out the recording afterwards. So chime in, ask questions, anything. But for now, I am going to kick it over to Amanda.
Oh, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of your faces. So I will start with a quick little slide presentation, but we'll spend most of the time talking. If there's anything as we're going that I say that you're like, what, that's not clear, please explain more, feel free to jump in and stop me and ask that question. I really welcome that. Yeah, because if you have the question, it's very likely that someone else does also. I hope that everyone can see my screen. If you can't, let me know. Okay. So, oh, and I'm going to send this out to everybody afterwards, so you don't have to worry about you know, writing everything down. If there's some resources in here that might be helpful, but don't stress about it because I'll make sure that you get a copy. About me, so I've been doing this for over 20 years, which is really crazy. And this topic today is one that is newer in the world. It wasn't something that we were really talking about, at least not in my circles of data management when I started 20 years ago. And so it's something that's really near and dear to my heart for a few reasons. One is that there's, you know, a lot that we do in advancement services or prospect research really is important and has impact, but this is one of those places where our work actually has some social justice implications that I think are really interesting and also cutting edge. That's another thing that interests me about this is that, yeah, changes in IRS tax law around donor advised funds are interesting, but this is really interesting to me because it's new and it's something that we're all trying to figure out together. So I work with nonprofits of all sizes and it's all on donor data management. Occasionally I'll get roped into like volunteer management stuff, but pretty much is what is your database doing? Is it doing what you want? My background is in prospect research, so that's always the orientation that I'm bringing toward my work, even though I'll be honest, I have to admit it's been a few years since I've been an on-the-ground prospect researcher. So I'll be looking forward to hearing some of your experiences around this topic as well, because I think some of you will have more current job stories at the very least. Okay, so that's a little bit about me, and since you can all read, I'm not going to read it to you. All right, so when I was doing a little bit of research to look for resources for this presentation, I came across this quote. It's from the Transgender Workplace Support Guide, which is from English public health organization, lgbthealth.org.uk. And this really struck me. So the person describes that they had a workplace protection policy, but it didn't say anything about data. Now, of course, this is in the context of an employee, and a lot of the resources I was able to find are really like employment law related, but the principle really still carries through. So this person started a new job, And in their new job, the manager had access to both their old name and their new name. And they refused to get rid of the copies that had the old name, even though, you know, presumably maybe they wouldn't need them. And with no data protection policy, this person was unable to know who at their workplace was aware that they're transgender and who wasn't. And that's really dicey for a person who is transgender. And we're going to talk a little bit about why, because I think one of the things about this topic is to have an understanding that unlike something like donor advised fund tax law, this can have very real implications for our constituents in their lives, and dangerous implications even. So we're going to talk about 3 issues and then how to really do this in your database. So one is respect, the next one will be safety, and then we'll also talk about some of the demographics around this, because the first 2 reasons are compelling in and of themselves, and then the third reason is just there's a demographic tidal wave coming in your direction no matter what you do. But before that, I have a little poll. I'm curious about what's going on at your organization. So if you could please let me know, have you made any changes to how you're managing data because you're trying to be more inclusive of people with diverse gender identities? And this isn't a right or wrong kind of question. It's just to get a sense of where are we all at with this. It's so exciting to watch the results in real time. Ooh. Okay, so it looks like of those who we've heard from, most of you have not addressed this yet. So welcome, I'm glad you're here today. And for the person who has, if later you would share your experiences, I'd be very curious to hear how that's going for you and what kind of changes that you are making. All right, cool. So why does this all matter? The first reason is just to basic respect. If we care about our constituents, and that's one of the things I love about prospect researchers is that I think there's this inherent caring in our profession where we bring a sense of ethics to our work, and we think a lot about the data that we're collecting, managing, storing, and transmitting to our end users because we take our responsibility as custodians of the data very, very seriously. And so I think this goes hand in hand with that, where because we are serious about the constituents that like sworn to protect our constituents, or I don't know, for constituents whose data we're already handling, we care about that, right? And so when it comes to somebody who's transgender, it actually becomes very much, it can be a serious issue if we're not willing to be respectful of that data. So it's both about just the basic respect we show to all of our constituents, and then it's also safety. I was speaking with a group about this one time, and one of the participants in the discussion said, you know, what if we were to send a piece of mail to somebody that had their old name on it, and then their neighbor sees it, and now their neighbor knows that they're transgender? And unfortunately, in the United States, and in many places around the world, just simply being transgender is a safety risk for you. You're much more likely to be assaulted by somebody. So you might make some decisions around who in your life is allowed to know this information about you, and you may not want it to be your nosy neighbor. So there's an actual safety issue, and you could think of examples beyond this, you know, stray piece of mail, but just in general, that it's incumbent upon us to keep this information private if we have access to it. And there's also just this stunning demographic shift that when I did research for this, I actually like re-looked this up because wow, that is a lot of people. That is a lot of people. So what we see is that younger people, and so for especially any of you that are in a university setting, this is probably something that has come up on your campus or will be soon. So people who are 18 to 34, 12% identify as not being what is called cisgender, and we're going to define these terms in a minute. So that's 12% of people who say I am transgender, which is a lot of people. So that means that even if we didn't have concerns about respect and safety, which are completely sufficient in and of themselves to do the right thing, we would still have this demographic wave that is coming our way of, I don't know that it necessarily means that there's been a shift in how people are feeling. It might just be more that younger people feel more comfortable to be who they are and to be open about it. So, you know, I won't get into what's going on behind these numbers, but I will say that these numbers are here, and it means that for your organization, you know, realistically, you have constituents who are transgender. And so this is something that, you know, if it hasn't crossed your desk yet, it will soon. Okay, so what do? The great news is that actually we can make our data management easier, including how we code things. And so one of the things that I really love is that when the easy thing to do, the right thing to do is also the easy thing to do. And in this case, it actually is, which is awesome. So we're going to talk about what to do in your database. I've put some terminology in here. Most importantly for this conversation, to understand that when I say gender identity, that is a person's own emotional and psychological sense of their gender. That is contrasted with when we say sex, that's ascribed to a baby when they're born based on their physical characteristics. So whatever you have when you come out of the womb, they decide it looks the most like this, and so you are that, versus someone's gender identity, which is this is who I know myself to be. So somebody who is transgender, that means that who they know themselves to be doesn't match with how they were described when they were born. Whereas I personally identify myself as cisgender. So my gender identity matches up with what people thought when I was born, and so that makes my life a little bit easier. That also means that people assume that my preferred pronoun is she and her, which is true. And so that's something that I meant to do at the beginning, and I will be honest, I've been really bad about it. I am trying to incorporate into business settings to say, my name is Amanda, and the pronouns I use are she and her, which helps to normalize that practice so that somebody who maybe it's a little less obvious by looking at them, you know, and you shouldn't assume anyone's pronouns just by looking at them, but people generally assume that I go by she and her because of the way my appearance presents itself, and they're right. But the more that we can all take responsibility for saying this is the pronoun that I use, then that makes it more comfortable for everybody to be open about what they prefer. One of the things we talked about is this idea of safety. And so the last concept that I'll mention that's really important is this idea of outing someone. So to disclose to somebody else that someone is transgender without their permission is what's called outing. And you might remember that term originating from disclosing that somebody is gay or lesbian. And it's also applied to transgender people. And so one of the things that we want to do with our data management is not out someone. So what does this mean? Names, gender, pronoun, gender-based titles like Ms. or Mr., and relationships. These tend to be the places in our databases or in our prospect research profiles where this issue touches. So with names, always use someone's preferred name. And I think that's really our standard in advancement anyway. I mean, if someone is like, you know, I really prefer to be called Muffy, that's fine. We will put you in our database as Muffy and refer to you as Muffy for the rest of your life. We don't have a problem with that. Should you store someone's legal or birth name? Generally, the answer is no, but for those of you in a university setting where you have a combined student and alumni database, you may have to. Similarly, if you're in a healthcare setting, there may be specific reasons that you have access to someone's legal or birth name in their records. If you are in a situation where there is no compelling business reason to keep that information, then I invite you to please ditch it. And I've heard people say, well, what about prospect research, right? Because I will do a better job of finding this person if I know other names that they've been known by. And the answer is yes, but it is not sufficiently compelling. Our needs as prospect researchers do not outweigh this person's needs around privacy, respect, and safety. So in this case, we can say, you know what, I'm willing to take the loss of my research ability by not storing this information. So similarly, if you're producing a profile about somebody and you do have access to their old name and then, presumably the information that they're transgender, this would not be something to include in a research profile, right? It's not relevant to how you're going to cultivate a donor relationship. There is an exception to this. If the person is, let's say, a vocal transgender advocate, and they have publicly disclosed in multiple news articles that they are a transgender person, then that's completely acceptable and appropriate to put in your research profile. You probably still wouldn't need to include their former name though. Still, you could say this person, his name is this, who is a prominent transgender advocate. In that case, it is relevant because that's something that's really, front and center about their life. But for everybody else, it's not relevant. In the same way that you wouldn't write a profile and say, Robert Thomas, who is a male, it's really not necessary. But if you do have in your database this information, a valuable internal conversation, how do we protect this data? Are there ways to put this in a field that's not visible to all of our users? Are there ways, what kind of policies do we need to enact around this? Where is this data visible? What reports is it used in? Is it used in any reports? So there are a lot of questions to ask yourself about name. Similarly, gender. This is another one of those where if you are in a higher education or healthcare setting, you may be a little stuck with this information. But if you are not, then I advise you to not track someone's gender at all. And I do have, for those of you who are like, well, I would like kind of a sense of who my people are. We can talk about tracking pronoun. I was working with one of my clients and I said, have you thought about not tracking gender? And they were like, yeah, I get why we wouldn't, but I would like to have some more information about who the person is and kind of have that feeling for who am I picking up the phone to call. I said, well, why don't you track their pronoun? That's a lot easier to ask someone, like, hey, what pronoun should I use for you? What pronoun do you prefer? Versus, could you tell me your gender identity? I don't know why, but the pronoun feels a lot, like it's a lot more common. It's more what we're used to sharing in meeting settings now, or maybe we put it in the foot of our email, whereas gender identity still feels very complicated and personal. But if you do have a reason, a compelling business reason to track gender, then Tinder does it really well. This article's a few years old, but they made some changes a few years ago where if you sign up for their dating app, you describe your gender, and it will actually pre-fill with gender identities that other people have selected. So you can be like, oh yeah, I am a trans woman, that sounds right. Or you see there's this little X here where you can say, nope, that's not me, and you can type in anything you want, whatever accurately describes your gender in your own eyes. And that is really the gold standard for collecting and tracking gender information, is because it is so complex and there are so many possible different ways that somebody could identify. When you are collecting that, make sure that you offer that self-defined option. So I prefer to self-describe, and here's what I describe as. Then if you do keep track of that, put it in your database, because it's not just we don't want to use it just like as other, right? It's not like this throwaway information. If we're going to be serious about being respectful to somebody, enough to ask them, what is your gender identity, or what is your gender, then what they tell us we should accommodate. And not all of our databases are ready to do this. There are still some that are seriously stuck, like male, female, and like unknown or other, which is just awful. So don't use other, which just is, it's funny because there's this term to other someone, which is to like set them aside from you because of their perceived differences. And so we are literally othering someone when we use that database field. So what do we do? Put it in attributes, or I'm joking for you razor edge people out there. Everything is supposed to go in attributes, right? But seriously, find a custom field to put that information in if it's something that you're needing to track. And always give people the option to not disclose. They can choose prefer not to say. So what's an easier way to do this? Pronouns. Pronouns are a lot easier. Common pronouns that people use: he, him, his, her, she, hers, and they, them, theirs. There are some less common pronouns, so much like with gender, if somebody says, actually, I prefer Z in here, which was a gender neutral pronoun that gained a lot of traction in the late 90s and early aughts, but then since then, I think more people have trended towards they and them. But if somebody says, this is how I prefer to be addressed, great, we can add that to our database because we have a flexible code table. And again, if we don't, well, probably your database doesn't come with a pronoun field anyway. And if someone has seen that, let me know, because that would be incredibly progressive and exciting. So this is probably a custom field no matter what you're doing. All right. Gender-based titles. This is another one of these places where it actually could be easier. We could just get rid of those. So some organizations that is not going to fly, just more traditional, or I live actually in Belize in Central America, and when I meet someone here, it would be common for them to introduce themselves as hi, I'm Mr. Garcia, or hello, I'm Ms. Castillo. And when you're addressing somebody in a business, anyone who's a government official or someone you don't know well, you're expected to use Mr., Mrs., Ms. with them. So in this culture, we would be in a really different place if I said, oh, just take those titles out of your mailing list, you don't need them. People would be like, oh my goodness, we absolutely do. If you're in that setting, that's real. So if you are needing to use gender-based titles, then add the option of MX, which is the gender neutral title. So on your drop-down menus, if somebody's giving a gift online, let them self-select that option. If you can get rid of it, great, that makes your mailings a lot easier. Obviously, don't get rid of titles that are based on someone's life achievements, so military honorifics, doctors, reverends, judges, all of that. We keep those folks, but those that are solely hey, you're perceived to be a male, so you're Mr., we can usually get rid of those comfortably. And in fact, for a lot of our younger donors, they're going to feel more comfortable without them. But again, you know the unique culture of your organization and which direction is better to go. Do you add more options or just take it all away? Relationships. This is another place where it's what? This is actually easier. So instead of having these very complicated code tables of mother-daughter, we can just have parent and child, sibling. And fun fact, I learned the gender-neutral term for niece and nephew is nibbling, but there's not yet right? I was like, what? Okay, that's awesome. But there's not an agreed-upon term for aunt and uncle yet. Some people are trying to shop pibbling. I don't know. We'll see if it takes. But there's a solution to everything out there. Okay. So names, gender, pronoun, gender-based titles, and relationships. Those are the places in your database or in your profiles where this issue is going to come up and where you can usually make some changes in the direction of more simple that make your, I heard somebody refer to it as de-gendering their database. So you can either de-gender or expansively gender your database. Those are kind of the two directions that you can go in. And when you're ready to do this, find everyone in your organization who touches your data. Make sure that you're all going to be on the same page about this. And this is a nice one of those kind of nice cross-departmental task forces where you could have a representative of each team come together and come up with what are going to be our new data management standards around this. And of course, document, document, document. Something else, if you are not, if you're like, I don't even know where to start with as well, now you know where to start because we've had this conversation. But if you're like, this is not my area of cultural competency, I feel like I don't have a lot of knowledge on this issue, I'm not sure if I'm going to proceed with it in the right way or comfortably. And that's a real concern. I mean, that's for some of us, if we are not a transgender person or if we haven't met a lot of transgender people in our life or haven't spent a lot of time considering these issues, it's new and it can feel like, I don't want to do this wrong. I want to do the right thing, but how do I do that right thing in a way that's not going to be personally embarrassing or offend other people? And there are other organizations in your area, and I don't know Minnesota well, and so this is somewhere where this could be part of our discussion is what are the resources locally. So I've definitely shared some resources with you in this presentation, which I'll send out to you, and you got some of them ahead of time as well. But if you're on a university campus, you probably have gay and lesbian student organization, or hopefully even an office on campus that's devoted to the needs of your transgender students. So work with them. They will be so happy that you are doing this. They will want to provide you with resources. And if you are not on a university campus and you're not in a setting where you naturally have, if you don't have an HR team that has a specialist in this area, that's okay. There are other organizations in Minnesota that advocate for the rights of transgender people, excuse me, if I can talk. So there is no harm in calling them and saying, you know what, I work at a nonprofit organization, we're trying to make some changes and make sure we do this the right way. And if there are several of you on this call today who are like, we're all going to start moving in this direction, team up, right? This is not something that you have to do in a vacuum. You could certainly say, well, what are you doing and what's your policy, and could we share our documentation with one another? Because this isn't, it's, in a way, once you start doing it, it's simple, and then it will come up with your unique challenges in your office, which may include coworkers who don't understand. So one of the things that could become your role is to learn more about transgender issues in general, which is why the first couple of resources are just more general, like, hey, have more of an understanding of this issue so that when you're having this conversation at work, you feel better equipped to advocate for your position. So now you have an understanding of, okay, well, what would it look like to make our data management more inclusive? But then also being able to just have the conversation around, hey, did you know this is actually a safety issue for people? And did you know that's actually really hurtful for folks when we call them by the incorrect name? And there may be people in your office who haven't thought about that yet or don't know that, and are hopefully open to having those conversations. So that's plenty of me talking. Let's discuss what's going on with, where are y'all at? So we did a little poll. Most people haven't started to address this yet. We've got one person who's in the process. If you're willing to tell us who you are and what that's about, I'd love to hear it. Or any questions that you all have thus far that you either brought today or that came up while I was kind of rapid fire information, because I wanted to get to the chatting part.
I don't really have anything to add, but I just appreciate that Jana organized this and that you presented to us. I think it's a really good thing to do. And I know because of the murder of George Floyd here, a lot of organizations are really trying to work on issues of race. And, my whole thing is that diversity is diversity. It's not just race. Race might be foremost in many people's minds now, but we need to be aware of this. So I think it's excellent timing.
Well, good. And we set this up long ago, so I'm glad the timing worked out really well. I have one question for you. That's a situation that came up a few months ago for me. We have a prospect at our organization that I was doing research on, and she was a well-regarded military official in her former life. And so in coming across news articles, like historic news articles that used her dead name to reference her military service, I was having trouble in writing the research profile around, like, could I quote any of these articles? We've saved a bunch of these articles in kind of our background on her, but a lot of them are articles from 10 or 15 years ago that use dead names. And should those be deleted? Can I adjust quoting articles to quote current names in research profiles without that causing issue? That was a bit of a challenge for us.
Yeah, oh, that's a good one. Okay, so I have an easy answer and then an I don't know answer. So I think the easy answer is yes, you can change it's fine. You're not putting together like a scientific paper or I mean, you obviously would never change an article if you wouldn't fabricate something, but to, change it so it's got the correct name and pronoun, I don't see any problem with that whatsoever. Is the fact that this person is transgender something that is broadly known about them? And like, it doesn't sound like it's secret because they're a very prominent person and there's news articles about them. So I would think it's not the same as you have access to their student records and you see that their name used to be Vanessa and now it's Albert, right? Like, that's more of a, hey, that doesn't need to appear anywhere in their donor file, right? In this case, I would certainly adjust the profiles so that you're referring to them by their correct name and pronoun throughout. And then I don't think that there's a need necessarily to get rid of the old articles. I mean, they're already, they're on the internet anyway. So the next time somebody goes to research this person, then they're going to just Google the same articles again, right? I do think maybe putting a note just to say, like, just making it really clear in your files that this person's name is this and that their pronouns are that. And stating it in a way, just as with anything else we do with any of our donor profiles, stating it in a way that they would not feel uncomfortable reading themselves. But you could say, like, they used to be known as this other name with these other pronouns, and when we do research profiles, we are very careful to use the correct name and pronouns. To say that, and like, there's a more elegant way to say that, but just to make sure that, if you are storing information that points kind of in the wrong direction, if you will, in terms of name and pronoun, that any of your colleagues that come along later see very clearly, like, oh, this is historical, it's very much public information, that's why it's on file here, and we're really careful in talking about this person in a respectful way. Something like that, I think.
That's helpful, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I love that question because I'm like, I don't know.
I can speak to my past 2 jobs and very different situations that happened and how we manage the gender reassignment, if you will, in our databases. So the first one I worked at St. Catherine University, which the undergraduate school is women only. And then of course, when they started questioning, whether to accept trans people into undergraduate, they made the good and right decision to do so. So eventually we had trans people coming to the school and then getting employed by the school. And we had to make adjustments to the database. We were able to change some of the pronoun coding. It was still kind of limited to what they did, but to kind of note that change, just because it is a women's undergraduate, and suddenly there's a Michael or a Jonathan, right. You have to kind of figure out a nice, polite way to show, like, this person either was trans when they were here or they transitioned afterwards. It's all about using that back end note sections, noting somewhere like Michael used to be Vanessa when they were a student at wherever. So we use that a lot. And then of course on alerts as well, if we couldn't put the pronoun in right away, especially for our new staff member that had come in who was trans and used them, we made sure to put, and actually the HR put a very specific note on that person's record to say, this person goes by these pronouns, while we worked out why, how to make the system work for us. So at my previous employer at Augsburg University, all genders can attend the undergraduate, etc. And I had been doing research on a prospect whose child had recently had a reassignment. And we had to figure out a way, because it really wasn't fully in the system, that this child, had anything to do with us outside their parent, but they could at some point. And so we had to find a nice way to make sure that we kept the note from the gift officer kind of front and center, but also very respectfully actually making the name change, making the pronoun change, because they did transition to a he, him pronoun. And then, you know, just making sure that we put an alert on that record to, you know, this person changed or made an adjustment to their gender assignment at a certain date, because it was very important for that person to have, for that gift officer to have that date in there, because it was important to the prospect. And so I think really talking through with your gift officer who has the relationship with these folks to really find out, like, what is it that's important? What is it that we need to make happen so we can be as respectful and inclusive as possible? Sorry, that was really long.
No, that was great. And I love both of those stories, and especially the one you just told, because I think you just pointed to something really different, which is the difference between self-disclosed and implied information, if you will. Like when you've got, again, with the student records example, because it's just the easiest one to draw on, but when you've got access to student records information, that's kind of implied knowledge, right? Where you're like, oh, I could see that this person is transgender, versus I'm a development officer, I've met with somebody and they've shared personal information with me. And I think we often look at that around health issues too, right? Like if we meet with a prospect and they're like, I'm having cancer treatment right now, that's something that we might note in their file. But if we work for a health institution and we see that they're having cancer treatment right now, we're not going to put that, I mean, hopefully we're not going to see that, right? And it's been a minute since I've looked at HIPAA, so any of you healthcare people could correct me and say, oh no, we're allowed to have that now. But yeah, so that's like what you're talking about is something that your prospect told the development officer because it was important information to them. And so making sure to be respectful about how you track that, but to know this is something that is important because it is something that they shared with me. So thank you, that's a great story. What else is going on for folks? Questions or what you're up to at your organization to make any changes or yeah.
Oh, we're a disaster. We need to make so many changes. We're on this like outdated database that nobody uses, where couples are grouped together and they're an individual record if they share the same last name, and then their salutation is Mr. and Mrs. or Dr. and Mrs., but can't be Dr. and Mr., you know, like, and yeah, it's bad.
That's rough.
And if they have different last names, then they get coded as a dual record. So they can both have their own salutation. And it's like, and our gender tags, the options are like male, female, unknown, blank, couple, organization, and joint. You know, it's like, oh God. So we're recognizing like we desperately need to make a change, but it is also a massive undertaking to like revamp the whole database, and it keeps moving lower and lower on my coworkers' priority list and higher up mine as we keep sending awful mail to Mr. and Mrs. Lee and Mr. and Mrs. You know, Edge, even when there isn't necessarily. Oh, it's bad.
That's rough. Okay, wait, so can you just code everybody as a joint, even if they have the same last name, so that it's consistent?
We can, but we didn't do that historically.
Right?
And, you know, our records are also primary record owner and spouse are the labels on them, not, you know, person one and person two. Or, oh, we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm sorry.
Overwhelmed too.
Yeah, yours is okay.
As to where to start, because we're, I wouldn't say we're conservative, but we are a Catholic university where, we're not same gender like St. Catherine's, but used to be all male. And so there is the primary record and then the sort of household, which is a spouse. And I remember having two male spouses, and the gift officer would not have it. I said, they're legally married. And the gift officer said, no. According to Catholicism, they're not married. They're partners, but they're not married. And so this is what I have dealt with personally in my work as a prospect management partner. So I'm a little overwhelmed with how we're going to do this very necessary step to become more inclusive.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think, okay, the first situation with the same-sex couple, that came up for us at one place I worked many years ago, and it was before gay marriage was legal everywhere. And so we had a lot of domestic partnerships, and we decided to use the spouse function of our database for anybody who was, a couple in a household where it made sense that we would be jointly soliciting them. And so, not that it changes your colleague's heart or mind in any way, but to say, you know what, let's ignore the fact that the database calls this spouse and just know that this is how we combine people for the purposes of mailing, and because we're going to solicit them together. So that, I don't love that answer because I feel like it's kind of a cop-out. But then the larger and deeper question that you're bringing up is, how do I have this conversation in a reluctant workplace?
Yes.
That's tough. And one of the things, does your university have anyone on campus who is any sort of an advocate for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people? I don't know how. I know there's a scale of conservatism among Catholics in general and at Catholic universities. So I'm not sure where your institution falls on that scale. But if your colleagues are just maybe a little bit more old school, but there's somebody on your campus who this is their job already, make friends with that person. I think because I think you're going to need some support in this, and probably ongoing venting with somebody and some strategizing around, how do I have these tough conversations? And I think that the more you feel really versed in the issues, and then more background research, and of course we're all researchers, right? So the more that we know, the more confident we feel. So I would say use your prospect research skills to really get versed in this issue, so that you feel like you're standing on very firm ground when you start having these conversations with your more maybe difficult coworkers. Because I think, for me at least, if I'm like, we should do something about this issue that I know a little bit about, and then someone's like, push back, I'm like, okay, never mind. Whereas if I'm like, no, we should do something about this issue that I have information about, and here's the solution, and I feel well-versed, then I'll be more likely to, withstand their pushback. I hope
that is
answer helps. And
that
I
actually
love
is
that
good.
you want to do that shift.
Thank you. And it did remind me that we do have, because we had some really difficult racial incidents happen in the last couple of years. As part of the plan to combat racism, we developed an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it's been very heavily focused on racial diversity, but truly DEI, stands for inclusion as well. And I think this is a really wonderful time. And I will educate myself with those resources so that I feel confident. I just read, this was totally anecdotal, but I want to find it. I heard on NPR there is a woman came out with a new book about very famous speeches that are she rewrote them in a poetic approach as if a woman had said them. So Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream so I was thinking, just throwing it out there. If we're on the subject of it, I had this idea, but totally, and I laughed so hard. But I want to find it, and I want to make sure that when I do approach this director of diversity, equity, inclusion to help move it forward in the right way. But I also am very, educated and, like you said, assertive.
What's the name of the book?
I don't know. That's what I was saying. I was just driving, and NPR was on. I got to look it up. You will probably find it before I do, Miss Researcher. I want to find that. Let us know.
Can I ask Sam and Renee a bit if your organizations are doing much with this, since you're both kind of healthcare or healthcare adjacent? I know healthcare tends to be a bit further along in this, but also struggles because medical records can get tracked differently than donor records.
Right. It does for us. Our records in our database are all uploaded directly from the medical record. So it's already, whatever's in there is already in there, which requires us to make a lot of changes if things come up. Because the population of a lot of the people that are receiving patient care from us has gone down in age. So we're hitting that 20 to 30 age range. So a lot of these issues are coming up now. And I actually invited our database manager to come on this call today, but she couldn't make it. So I'm glad to see someone's recording, because I want to definitely give it to her so that she can check it out and see if there's anything that might be helpful for us. But it's becoming obviously an issue in our database that we really need to try to make some adjustments and solve. So this has been great and really informative. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Amanda. It was really great.
Oh, welcome. Well, I love that people are addressing this issue. It really is, and it's just heartwarming to see. I mean, I knew prospect researchers, yes, we care, but it is lovely to see that people want to do what's right by the folks around them. And we have a question on chat from Amy. What is the proper respectful wording in a profile when someone identifies as transgender or has a child that is transgender? Is it appropriate to lower development officers? And excuse me, I'm switching to my speakerphone. My headphone just went on me, but can everyone still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So we've questioned what is appropriate wording in a profile if someone identifies as transgender or that their child does. Is it appropriate to let your development officers or VP or president know? My answer is very much it depends. I would say that if it's something that's very important to this person, if the fact that they're transgender is something that they are very vocal about, and let's say that they've been in the news saying I'm a transgender person and I'm really proud of it and I want people to know that about me, and this is important information that I'm putting out there, absolutely. If it's more like this because you've done research and you see that the news articles refer to them one way in the past and a different way in the future, or in the future. That would be cool, in the present. Or you've got access to their student records, so that when they were on campus, they went by a different name. I would say, honestly, that's not relevant to their donor relationship unless they decide it's relevant. And this comes into that question of outing someone, where by virtue of your research position, you have access to information that they very well may choose to keep private in their life. And knowing that someone is transgender should not change the way your VP or your development officer approaches an ask with them. I can't imagine how it would, and if it did, then that would be problematic, right? And so then all the more we would probably not want to share that information. So yeah, I would say unless it's really relevant. I mean, if you work for a gay rights organization, and that person has been a prominent voice in the transgender community, that's a different kind of prospect profile, right? Versus just, oh, this person's a banker and they're married. Oh, and by the way, they're transgender. It's probably more relevant that they're a banker and that they're married, and not so much that they used to be called by a different name.
I would just say at the U of M, we have a Center for Sexual Health, and we have raised money for them. And so that's a very specific clientele. I mean, it's not like all of their clients, I don't know, they call them patients. I used to work for the Medical Foundation, then we merged. And so with the U of M Foundation, so I haven't done that in a while. But I know in some cases that was important information, and it was part of the research request was, this information, we're looking for them to give money to this, and can you find if they've given to other causes or whatever. But obviously that person had disclosed that information. So that makes it different, and it was relevant. If you're raising money for example, the Carlson School of Management, it's much more likely that it's totally irrelevant. Or for the stadium, or something like that. So
that's an excellent point, right? So we've got did they self-disclose it, and is it relevant? I think those are excellent points. And it's a little bit like race and ethnicity data. That often does not and should not come into play when we're fundraising, but if we're fundraising for a special program that's going to be culturally relevant to that person, then their cultural background may actually be important and may be something that we would include within our research profile or within our prospecting efforts. But in general, like you said, if you're fundraising for a stadium or just or the business school, then we don't care what somebody's gender or their race is, right?
Yeah.
Great example. I like that.
So we have 5 minutes left here. I'd love to hear what anybody's planning to do as a next step. Like, my plan is to take Amanda's portion of this recording to send to my database manager and my head of philanthropy operations, just so, one, they can see it. And I think I'm going to put in a ticket with our database company about changing some of our gender coding. The salutation coding is on us, and that's going to take a while, but I'm going to keep trying to move it up the priority list. But the gender coding is on my database company, so I'm going to put in a ticket and see what they can do about making that better. How about you guys? What's up next?
I plan to share it with people in my department and maybe with HR. I don't know. I have to say I don't know all the things we've done, so I don't want to say we haven't done something when we have. But I think it's helpful to share.
Anybody else?
I guess I can just say our database is very much stuck in like 1952. That was one of the things that I thought was the weirdest when I started, was that it's very it's Mr. and Mrs. and I just checked our gender options for making a new record, and it's male, female, or unknown, and I'm like, yay, not yay. There was one, and it's kind of sad. I don't feel like we have as diverse a donor pool as we could. So I think I've had exactly one instance where it was a same-sex couple, and I was like, how do I make a record for these? How do I make the household record? Because I'm like, it's gonna want me to choose one is primary and one is secondary, and I'm like, I don't know how this works. And so it's something that I think needs to be addressed, but I don't necessarily know, knowing the organization, that it will. Although we do, supposedly they are going to be as part of our new priority strategy, putting something on healthcare inequalities. So maybe that'll bring it to the forefront.
We've got a couple little audio issues. I don't know if you guys are hearing those too. Maybe it's me, but
Well, I look forward to delving into some of the resources, as I mentioned, and then probably reaching out to our director in diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's the university-wide, yes, department, and share. And from there, it would be, like Jana said, bringing it down into our advancement department and our, system to see what our options are. And I think we can, I like how you said, I wrote it down, either de-gender or expansively gender the database. And I think that would be something I would like to, share with the database systems manager and see which direction we could go. Yeah, so thank you.
Great. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today. This was super valuable, and I'm excited to kind of keep going down this journey and digging in more and starting some real battles with my database company.
Well, Janet, thank you so much for inviting me and everything you do to help me get set up. And thank you all. This was a great, lively conversation. And for any of you that do go back to your organizations and advocate for this and make changes, I would love to hear from you. I mean, I'd love to hear from all of you, but I especially love those stories of here's what we did, and because I do think this is a very much an evolving topic, and so I'm learning just as much from every conversation I have about this as I think I'm sharing. So please let me know how it goes.
Great.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And thanks everybody for joining in on the conversation. It's good.
Yeah, thank you guys. So we'll send the recording and the slides out later today or first thing tomorrow. And keep an eye on our website for any of our other future upcoming events. There's a lot coming up soon. So. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.